Anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time in this first hour kind of backing away from what is in the news. Of course, we have the New Hampshire primary tonight, and we'll spend a little bit more time in the second hour getting into that. And, of course, tomorrow we'll have full coverage on what happened, who was voted in, and which campaigns are actually beginning to move forward, which ones may drop out. So we'll have a lot to talk about tomorrow. But sometimes when it's a pause before the storm, this is a great time to maybe learn some spiritual lessons. So we're going to do that, and I will mention in the second hour we'll get into again a number of issues in the news. So if you'd like to join us, feel free to give us a call. Many of you yesterday were not able to get through, and we'll certainly give you an opportunity to express your opinion. But in the first hour I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking with Mike Fechner Jr. He is the son and eldest child of the late Mike Fechner, who is somebody that some of us know, and you might begin to see some of the connections as we go through the interview today, because we have talked on this program before about bridge builders. Might even remember an interview we did a while back in studio with Michael Craven, who actually heads up that ministry now, and others. But this is a story that is really powerful because it's entitled Lessons on the Way to Heaven, What My Father Taught Me. His father no longer is alive, but yet was a very gifted individual, and we learn lessons not only from his life, but of course from the son's life, who's in studio with us today. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the book, of course, it is published by Zondervan. Look for it in your local bookstore. I've read it from cover to cover and would really recommend it. If you'd like to know a little bit more about bridge builders, we have a link to hisbridgebuilders.org. They're going to even have a meeting and a banquet with individuals, been a good friend of this ministry, Eric Metaxas, so you can find out more about the ministry as well. But Mike Fechner Jr. is actually not only a Bible study teacher at Prestonwood Baptist Church, but also currently a student at SMU Law School. So, Michael, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I've known of your father. I have not known him very well. I've known of you, and certainly we're going to get to know you a little bit more. But this is an interesting phenomenon in that your dad was kind of working on a book, and then, of course, he went to be with the Lord. And instead of saying, well, that's the end of that, you decided to pick up those pieces, and it's reminiscent of something that went through my life. The original host of Point of View was Marlon Maddox. And as he was working on a project, he died and went to be with the Lord. And so I was able to pick up that project. So I have a lot of sympathy for trying to take another person's words, in this case your father's, in my case a previous host of Point of View, where I'm sitting in his chair now, and bringing it to an audience so that they can really learn some very important spiritual lessons. So you're to be commended. And you wrote this with Bob Welch, a good friend of the ministry here as well.
Yes. Yeah, it was really a great opportunity and an honor to be able to write it. The story is just my dad's story, and we got the contract on the book. My dad got a contract on the book on the day of his funeral.
Yes.
And we'd sent in a draft to the publisher and hadn't heard back for several months and thought it was just kind of dead in the water. And the day of his funeral, I got a phone call on my cell phone, and I let it go to voicemail. And later that day, I checked it, and it was the message saying, "Congratulations, you've got a contract." And it was a really exciting moment because I knew how happy my dad would be, but it was also one of those sad moments.
I guess.
But they called back a week later. I told them the news, and they said, well, would you be open to writing it? And I couldn't pass up on this opportunity to fulfill one of my father's dreams.
Well, it's very well written, and you and Bob Welch have done a very good job. And there's some lessons I want to talk about on the front end, because as we go through the interview, people will recognize it. And one is how God can turn around a life. And I want you to talk a little bit about how your father really never saw him working in impoverished areas in Dallas. Mm-hmm. Number two, what we as individuals can do, because I'm hoping that this interview and the book and all the other things you've done at Bridge Builders will encourage other listeners, because we, after all, broadcast broadcast in 40 different states, more than 40 different states around the country, and I'm hoping that everybody looks at the community next to them and says, maybe in our church we can partner with people in that church, or we can reach out to that community and maybe begin to make a real difference. So there's a lot of themes that come through this book, aren't there?
There are. He taught me many lessons, obviously 27 years worth before he went to be with the Lord, and I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a lot of time with him in ministry and on mission trips and just day-to-day life.
Well, again, let's talk a little bit about that. He was one of those individuals who's on his way to being successful, on his way to being a millionaire, and then he meets an African-American woman that really just changed his life and turned it upside down, right?
Yes, he did. I write in the book, his dream from the time he was a small child was to do one thing, and that was make a lot of money. And he saw his grandfather was very wealthy. He was a wealthy doctor, and saw the money rolls that he had. And my dad thought, that's the life. I just want to make as much money as I can, then I'll make it. And shortly into his 20s, he started to realize, I'm making some money, but this isn't fulfilling me. Maybe I'll make a little bit more. And he made some more, and it didn't fulfill him. And ultimately, he met Velma and Ramon, her son. Mm-hmm. And he started mentoring Ramon and getting to know Velma. And it was through that relationship that my dad started to be awakened to a different reality, a different life that exists outside of our North Dallas luxurious lifestyle. And his heart started to be a little bit changed and challenged that this isn't right, that people have to go through the struggles that they were going through and the challenges that they faced. And I think ultimately what broke my dad's heart was that Ramon was killed in a drive-by shooting.
I know. That's one of the more powerful parts of the book. And let's just help our listeners who don't live in the Dallas area. They are somewhere else, and they may be in Maine or Florida or Alaska or California or Iowa or wherever they might be. They probably think, okay, when I think of really impoverished areas, Watts in South Central LA comes to mind, Cabrini Green in Chicago, the Bronx, maybe something, wherever they might be thinking, Harlem. But if you look at the statistics, and we've posted some of those there, when you talk about the city or the area of a country which has the number one child poverty, it's in the area where your father was working. When you look at poverty at all, I think it's number 3. So we are talking about something that's in some ways almost like a third world country, isn't it?
It really is. And I think that we have the second fastest growing poverty rate in the country, only behind Flint, Michigan. And so you have all these different indicators that you don't necessarily associate Dallas with poverty.
No. Just the opposite, because lots of times people have seen the TV show or nothing else, or they've flown in the airport and they said, "Whoa, look at all the affluence." And that's the funny thing. Your dad working a half an hour from where he was working, where he's living, where he's working, you see the best of the best. You see multimillionaires. You see these McMansions. And then he goes down to places where, just to use Velma's house, I mean, there were holes in the wall, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, homes are dilapidated. They're falling down in violation of housing code left and right. And it was really, my dad, you can drive down one street and kind of get a panoramic view of South Dallas, and you can just see just the destruction that's down there. It's just a different world, and it's literally 15 minutes down the road.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, continue our conversation today. This is a book that I think you'll enjoy reading, but I think it will also challenge you to get out of your complacency. If you're ready to maybe get out of your comfort zone, this book will certainly challenge you, and that's what your dad was so good at. Lessons on the Way to Heaven, What My Father Taught Me, and it's Michael Fechner Jr., and it is published by Zondervan, and you can look for it in a local bookstore, but we also have information about it on our website. Let's take a break. We'll come back and continue our conversation right after this. Joel Rosenberg was on my radio program recently to talk about his new novel, The First Hostage. We didn't spend too much time talking about his book, but instead focused on the phenomenon of apocalyptic Islam. Let me explain what that is. There is both radical Islam as well as apocalyptic Islam. The vast majority of Muslims do not fit into either category. According to some reliable polls, only about 10% of the 1.6 billion Muslims subscribe to the concept of violent jihad. Millions and millions of Muslims may believe in Islamic eschatology and even believe that we're entering into the end time, but that doesn't mean that they believe in violence as a way to achieve it. Radical Muslim groups like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, the Taliban, and the Muslim Brotherhood may use violence against Jews and Christians. They want to push them off of Muslim lands. But they differ from apocalyptic Islam. Joel Rosenberg puts it this way: radical Islam seeks to attack us. Apocalyptic Islam seeks to annihilate us. Apocalyptic Muslim groups would include the leaders of ISIS, now called the Islamic State, and the top leaders in Iran. They're driven by Muslim prophecies that you can find in the Quran and the Hadith. They believe that the end of days is at hand, and they believe that their Islamic Messiah will come to establish an Islamic kingdom known as a caliphate. And they also believe that the Messiah will implement Sharia law throughout the globe and force everyone to submit to this caliphate. Now, Joel Rosenberg has found that few world leaders understand these issues. Sadly, the current president and many of the current candidates for president do not understand the danger of apocalyptic genocidal Islam. We should pray that they understand, because our future depends on it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again. If you would like to join us, feel free to do so, but this may be one of those ones where you can sit back and learn some of the lessons on the way to heaven. That's the title of the new book. It is published by Zondervan. As I said before, you'll probably be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link so that you can get a copy. It would be a real encouragement to anybody that is really kind of struggling with their priorities. Maybe they're dealing with materialism. Maybe they're wondering what God's plan for their life is. Maybe they can learn some vicarious lessons from Michael Fechner. And so I think this is just a great book in that regard. But also, I really want to challenge some of you to get out of your comfort zone and to recognize that maybe just a half a mile, maybe even 10 minutes from where you are, there is an opportunity for ministry. And certainly that is what happened to Michael. So here's Velma, and he begins to change his mindset a little bit and begin to think, well, maybe there's a place for a white guy in Black Dallas. There's a place for a rich guy in Poor Dallas, and begin to just see what he could learn. He also spent some time interacting with a prominent pastor who I also know, E.K. Bailey, who, again, is no longer with us, went on to be with the Lord. But that's where I think E.K. Bailey and Velma and some others said, you know, you need to really understand our community here. This is not a white guy coming to help us. We have some things to teach you, and obviously you have some things to teach us, right?
Absolutely. I think, you know, once my father's heart started to change and the Lord started to really show him these new things, he wanted to jump in both feet. He was ready to go. And EK, Dr. Bailey, and Velma were great at kind of saying, okay, Mike, you got to learn a few things first. You know, Jesus taught us a lot in the Bible that he spent time with his disciples preparing them to go out and do the ministry. And I think a lot of times whenever God puts something in our hearts, we're ready to go do it now. And if it doesn't happen now, we think something's wrong or this isn't for us. But for my dad, it was a great season of learning, listening, being patient. And for 3 years, my father was without a job, without a ministry, just learning, just trying to know the Lord in a whole new way, trying to learn lessons from Dr. Bailey and from Velma. And I think that that was the most crucial part of his life because it set him up and it prepared him for the next season of ministry that God had for him.
Even while that was taking place, though, he was sort of mobilizing some of the fellow Christians at places like Prestonwood Baptist Church. I'll pick on that church since that's his home and that's where you are now and everybody else. And I know that, for example, when Ramon was killed in a drive-by, he goes down, but then all sorts of other people from Prestonwood come down, and all of a sudden he's, saying, I couldn't be more proud of my church. So this idea of partnering in a North Dallas church with a South Dallas community, which we've talked about before with people like Tony Evans and people that have done Voice of Hope and Voice of Calvary and Step Foundation, of course, now Bridge Builders, is something that, again, is a model to think about. There are too many situations where we still have segregation. Now It's more of an economic, but sometimes racial segregation. And this is the idea of beginning to build bridges, right?
Absolutely. That's where the whole name comes from, is this idea that one side of the city is not better than the other side. One side isn't coming to teach the other side everything else. But if we will come together on a bridge, and if the church will help build that bridge, then we can see real transformation and restoration. And so the name Bridge Builders, my father's ministry, was birthed from that idea that if we can mobilize the churches in North Dallas or South Dallas, the wealthier parts of town to the poorer parts of town, then you can really start to see the body of Christ come together in a whole new way that will reflect heaven much more accurately. And I think that it's a great testimony to the city to say, okay, this is what the body of Christ really looks like. This is what new life really looks like.
One of his keys, and it's something I think all of us have to develop, but I think your dad almost seemed to have developed it naturally, is to be what you might call culturally bilingual. And that is, he could travel in the North Dallas community and be talking to real estate developers and millionaires and go out on a golf course, which he rarely did, it sounds like, from reading this book, but still interact with people or sit across from lunch and raise money and really just play in that community, if you will. But then he could go all the way down to South Dallas. And I think at least one individual said that even when your dad looked in the mirror, he really saw himself as a black man, as an African American, interestingly enough. That is a technique that he developed. That is an attribute he developed. But I think if we're going to be effective in ministering in more than one community, all of us need to develop it, don't you think?
Right. He really did develop some sensitivities to different groups of people. And kind of like Paul, whenever he went and traveled to the different parts of the world, he took on parts of their culture and incorporated them into how he taught and how he led them. And my dad really, I think he did see himself as an African American, and he loved their culture. He loved just the joy of that culture, the excitement, the loudness of it. My dad was so loud all the time, and but at the same time, he'd sit down at a nice steakhouse with a very wealthy businessman and talk about serious matters and talk about business and government, and talk about how they can be involved in the ministry and use their business to grow the kingdom of God. So he did. He had this kind of bilingualism that allowed him to be relevant in many different settings.
And again, we've sort of alluded to it, but let's talk about the fact that Paul, when he is writing to the church in Corinth, talks about the fact that when with the Jews and under the law, I was under the law, and those without the law, not the law, and I became a Jew to the Jews, a Gentile to the Gentiles. I became all things to all men that I might save some. And it seems to me that there are cultural distinctives. But if we're really going to be effective in the gospel, we have to make sure that those particular barriers do not exist. Instead of erecting barriers, we need to bridge those kind of barriers and build bridges, right?
Exactly. I think that a lot of times we need to remember what's the most important thing we're doing here. You know, I bring with me a lot of things that I think are important from my culture and from my background and upbringing. But are those really relevant to the gospel going forward? Are those really relevant to the kingdom of God moving forward? And if they're not, then they're secondary. And I'm not going to worry if they don't translate into this different setting.
Right.
I'm not going to say, well, I can't do that because they don't have the same views as me on this issue. And so I think as long as we keep the main thing, then we don't let those barriers separate us. But a lot of times we do bring those in with us.
Another one of those lessons is sometimes getting out of your comfort zone. Let's talk about that for just a minute, because you alluded to the fact that your father didn't have a job. And a lot of people say, yeah, well, he's almost a millionaire. But by the time he was done, your sweet mom was having trouble paying the light bill, basically. There's at one point where to keep Bridge Builders open, she sold her car. And, he was driving a Mercedes, and later he was driving, well, we won't even talk about the kind of car he was driving. So there was a willingness to go almost into poverty in order to be successful in this ministry.
Yeah, there really was. Whenever he sold his business, he had well over $1 million in the bank, and my mom thought the idea was, okay, we'll live off the interest. This will be fine. We can do that. Lots of families do that. But slowly and surely, he started giving away the principal.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, my mom's thinking, okay, we're running out of some principal here. But he did. He had this attitude that, listen, this is what God's called me to do, and I'm going to do it. And what I think it was for my father was it was a freeing. He was very materialistic. Like I said, he wanted to make money. That was his sole priority. And so him giving away that money was, in a way, him laying down his idols before Christ and saying, I don't need it. I don't care about it anymore. All I want to do is be obedient to the call of Christ. And a lot of times that does take us out of our comfort zone.
Sure. And I might just give credit. It was one of the sermons by another good friend of this ministry, Joe Stoll, who at that time was the head of Moody Bible Institute, who actually preached that. And he took it seriously and said, well, maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. Give up those things that are actually keeping me from following the Lord. So we're going to take a break, and I want to come back and talk about some of these issues of racial reconciliation. That is a topic that shows up first in his childhood, and then later when one of Velma's friends wants to just cash a check in a bank. And so I want to talk about that because that's an issue before us today. And again, you do not shy away from some of these controversial issues. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Michael Fechner. And if you'd like to join us, that number 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to sit back and just listen, you are welcome to do that as well. The book is entitled Lessons on the Way to Heaven, What My Father Taught Me. And we certainly encourage you to go to the website. You'll find a number of very good articles and resources today, including more information about bridge builders, which we've mentioned, information about the book, and, of course, a lot of material related to our conversation in the second hour, the Pray, Organize, and Vote, POV, because we are in the midst of the election season, and we will come back and spend some time in the second hour talking about that, including, of course, the New Hampshire primary taking place tonight. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about the book, more about bridge builders, go to pointofview.net. Or if you'd like to get some of those resources that we've been talking about so that you can make sure that not only are you registered to vote, but other people are registered to vote, and they have good information in a voter's guide, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation, talk about some of the issues of racial reconciliation, and a few other lessons on the way to heaven. All that coming up right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Our guest this hour is Michael Fechner as we talk about his book, Lessons on the Way to Heaven, What My Father Taught Me. It's published by Zondervan. Look for it in your local bookstore. But again, we have a link on our website and also some good information about bridge builders. And we'll get into maybe what people can do in just a few minutes. But the racial issue is important. And your father, even as a young child, began to see, was it in Virginia, I guess, the kind of apartheid, segregation, bias, as well as discrimination taking place. And then he ran into it again here in Dallas. Tell the stories, if you might.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first instance that my father had was when he heard a story from his mom about when she was growing up, and her and a friend that was African American went into a local store to get a Coke. And as they walked in, the owner of the store told her to get out and said, you can't be here. You can't come in here. And so they asked her to leave, and my grandmother, my dad's mom, was appalled by that. So what do you mean? I come here all the time. I buy Cokes from you all the time. And that was a story that stuck with my grandmother, and she passed down to my dad. And one of the first lessons that my father was taught, that's not right. That's not how, as Christians, we're called to love people. And then in Virginia, my father was a military brat, and some of his friends on the base were African American, and he got to experience for the first time what discrimination looked like when his friends were told that they couldn't come to a certain party or they couldn't hang out with a certain group of people. And so he got a few of these experiences when he was young, just seeing friends or hearing stories of my grandmother's friends that were discriminated against. And it was instilled in him from a young age that as a Christian and as a believer, that's not how we're to treat other people, but definitely something that carried through his life were those lessons he learned early on.
Well, and then there's a story there about Velma, who we mentioned earlier, who was so key in the starting up of Bridge Builders, who had a friend that needed to cash a check. Well, and he just naively says, well, let's just take her into this bank, and nobody would cash her check, you know, and he's thinking, okay, if I walk in here and cash a check, you know, I've got a suit, I'm white, I'm from North Dallas, probably no questions asked. Because she's not all of those things, nobody would cash the check until he started pulling some strings, and he began to realize once again that we still have a level of institutional racism, don't we?
Right, and that's one of the things that he really came to terms with, is I think that it's easy to sit back and when you live in a comfortable situation, it's easy to say that all of that has passed. We don't live in that era anymore. But I think that once you start to get involved and these people become your friends and you take them into your family, you know, and then you start experiencing these things where you can't get a check cashed at a bank, but then my father could walk in and he'd get it cashed immediately. You start to see that it's a different playing field for different people, and maybe not explicitly and maybe not in the way that it used to be, but there still are some undercurrents and some implied challenges that African American people and minorities face that we have to be cognizant of.
Well, and one of the individuals that was so influential in his life, other than Velma, was E.K. Bailey, pastor, Concord Missionary Baptist Church.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, then in the book you talk about E.K. Bailey getting cancer. And he spent a fair amount of time talking to your father about cancer, where, you know, there's a sense in which your dad was like, why am I hearing all of this? Of course, as we know the rest of the story, he as well got cancer. And that was kind of a turning point as well, because I think your father sometimes was thinking, well, if a person is doing the work of the Lord, then they're going to have special protection. And by the way, I happen to believe some of that too.
Right.
But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the rain doesn't fall on the unrighteous and righteous alike, and that cancer doesn't strike both Christians and non-Christians. And so that was another one of those learning lessons for your dad, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the things that my father was being transformed in throughout his life, is that from a very early age, God and Christ was a very transactional relationship. Okay, God, if I'm good here, you'll be good to me here. You know, if I go to church, then you'll bless my business. And, I think a lot of that carries on just naturally. We want to think that it's a relationship like that. But what my dad found out when he got cancer was that that's not always the case. That, like you said, sometimes bad things happen to relatively good people. And I think that that's when my father's faith was really challenged to say, okay, Mike, you've trusted me in some of the good times that you've had. Will you trust me now in the hard times and in the bad times? And really took him to a different level of faith where it was beyond just proclaiming Jesus when things are going well, but when things are bad and I might die, am I still going to have that same proclamation?
The other part of that is, at least you write about in the book, that in some respects, even though cancer was not something he asked for and certainly something he was hoping to be cured of, it provided opportunities for ministry that may not have existed before. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I'll tell you this, from the first day that he got cancer, it hit him pretty hard. And he admitted that he went into a little bit of a funk and had some of these questions, and I write about that in the book. And
sure.
I think that that's extremely natural. And but ultimately, those questions were answered through God's word and through other believers encouraging him. And it really provided a spark within my father that he'd always lived carefree and he'd always lived this life of dreaming big and going for it for the glory of God. And but once he got cancer and once he came to terms with that this is the path that Christ has given me, now how do I use this for his kingdom? He started to live in a way that I've never seen anybody live, where he had the freedom to do whatever God was. He just started going into different patients' rooms and saying, hey, I'm your neighbor next door. I'm getting treatment over there. I just want to stop by and see how you're doing and how I can pray for you, how I can encourage you. Mm-hmm. Here's some tickets to the ball game that you can take your family to. And it really just gave him this freedom to live like he was dying, because he was. And I think that was an incredible expression of ministry that we can all do, but we often aren't put in that circumstance.
And when he was in Los Angeles, he was meeting with some doctors and then said, where's the poorest place of L.A.? Well, go to Watts. And everybody, Mike Buster, everybody else says, no, I want to go home. He said, no, we're going to go there. Yeah. So then he, and your mother's terrified. He locks the door, goes up and talks to these gangbangers. And they're saying, well, what can they do for me? Cut me up? They've already cut me up. They're going to kill me. Well, I'm dying anyway. I mean,
exactly.
And it's just amazing, some of those stories. But again, just to show an opportunity that cancer provided. When he left the ministry, because for a while he was on the staff of Prestonwood Baptist Church, you used to talk about the fact he really was in a funk for a while. And part of that was he started a blog at the insistence of you and some others, and he had all of 30 people that were reading the blog. By the time, his cancer had been diagnosed and people knew about it, there were thousands of people that were reading his blog. So there is a sense of authenticity that came from some of that.
Right, absolutely. It did. It gave him a platform to begin to share to his friends and people that he knew that were concerned about his well-being. And my father used that to say, look, I'm glad that you're concerned about me, but I also want you to be concerned about the poor and the least and the lost. And so it gave him an opportunity to further his mission, that people began to become concerned about him, and he used that to turn them right back to the mission that God had given him.
That's amazing.
So,
now, again, we mentioned that he went through quite a bit, and they gave him only a few months, and he lived longer than that. But eventually, I guess we have to finish the story, and that is he did die. And you had a funeral, and I thought 2 points. Number one, there's, don't they call it Fechner Standard Time, because he was always late. So yes. I think Mike Buster actually brought the casket in after it started, so yes. That was part of it. But also, I think Jack Graham was saying that, they've had funerals at that church for Dallas Cowboys and, all sorts of very well-known individuals, but more people came out to your father's funeral than anybody else because of just the lives he touched.
Yeah, and that's what it is. My dad wasn't a celebrity. He didn't have huge name recognition across the country. He did it one life at a time, and he took the time to care about one person and that person's family, and then he cared about the next person. And one of the things I mentioned in the book, and I mentioned at his funeral, was that he was never too busy to take a phone call for someone in need.
Yes.
And he loved to be on the phone and loved to talk to people and just encourage them. And one of his disciples, Roderick, who lives in Bonton, was going through a hard time and had some questions. And my father was at the National Day of Prayer up in Washington, D.C. with the president at the time, and Roderick called him, and my dad took his phone call and said, "Hey, Roderick, I'm at the White House. What's going on?" And Roderick said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you." And my dad said, "No, I'm here for you. What do you need? How can I pray for you?
Yes.
What's going on?" And so I think that that's really the testimony of his life, is that you don't need a big stage. You don't need to be a celebrity to impact many, many people. It was one life at a time.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about bridge builders and some of the organizational ways in which you can be involved, either as an individual or maybe want to start something similar in your community. We'll continue our conversation. Michael Fechner with us as we talk about lessons on the way to heaven. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Michael Fechner Jr. with us as we talk about his book, Lessons on the Way to Heaven. And I know, of course, you're a student at SMU, but you have actually worked in the ministry before. And we have a link to his bridgebuilders.org. As I mentioned, Eric Metax is going to be speaking at your banquet, and you've had all sorts of people like Tim Tebow, and it's a kind of a who's who. But there's a real opportunity to be, like you said, an urban missionary. So talk about, for just a few minutes, how some of our listeners might be able to either connect with you or develop something like that in their own community.
Sure. Well, I think one of the pivotal starting points is one relationship. With my dad, it was with Ramon and Velma. And with people in San Antonio that run a ministry there, my uncle and my grandparents, it was with a teenager, a young boy and girl that needed a place to stay. And so I think that anybody that wants to be involved, whether it's with bridge builders or doing something in their own city, it starts with one relationship, and it's building that relationship, not to be a top-down approach, but to be a friend, to be a supporter, and to walk alongside them. One of the things that my dad used to tell people is, I'll walk with you as far as you want to walk. And he stuck to that. And so as long as somebody would walk with him, he'll keep walking with them. And that's, I think, the key to really getting involved. So being a friend, being a mentor is one of the key ways to be involved in a ministry like this.
You know, one of the lessons he learned is that if you really want to make it effective, you have to give it full time. Your dad is a little bit like me. He likes things to be organized and methodical and flow charts and all the rest. And that's when he finally realized that he had to get out of his comfort zone of being on the staff of Prestonwood Baptist Church and going full time. Then there was another time when he realized that I had to find some other people to come in so that it's just not a one-man show. So those are some really important pivotal points in the life and history of bridge builders, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that, like you said, he decided after a couple of years of hard prayer that if he was going to do bridge builders how God had called him to, then that he needed to resign from Prestonwood and devote all of his attention to it. And that was a tough thing for him because Prestonwood was a great place for our family. My siblings were at Prestonwood Christian Academy at the time, and so we weren't sure if they'd be able to stay there. And my dad had never taken a salary from bridge builders, and so he'd have to raise his own support for that. And it was a big challenge, but ultimately, after a couple of years, he said, okay, God, I've trusted you this far. I'll trust you again. And again, he went out and he asked some people that were prominent businessmen if they would consider serving with him. And so they joined the ministry and started serving with him there. But there's different levels of commitment. Some people are called to go full-time into ministry, like my dad was. Other people are called to serve through their business, using their business to employ and train up some people. Others are called to serve on the weekends. Whether it's coaching, one of the things I love to do, me and my brother do, is we coach the youth sports teams. And so there's these 3rd grade to 6th grade kids that we get to pour into and love on. And, they're looking for a big brother to look up to and to emulate. And so we get to be that. So there's all these different levels of commitment. I don't think everybody's called to do full-time vocational ministry, but we're all called to do full-time ministry in some way. Yeah. And so what the challenge is finding how can you leverage your skills and your passions to be about the kingdom of God.
Well, and again, one of the things I might mention is obviously you're there to minister, but you get ministered to as well. Last time we had Michael Craven in here. Here's a man that's been in the secular world and in business. And one of the stories I still remember him saying is this is the first time I've ever worked in a business where as I walk down the hall, people hug me, thank you for providing a job. So there is a sense in which you may think you're going in to help others, but in the long run, sometimes you feel like you're the greatest beneficiary.
Absolutely. A great example is I've got a friend named Clifton who I met when I was a senior in high school. Clifton's 7 years older than me. And Clifton was going through the GED program at the time and was separated from his family, and we just built a relationship. And at that point in his life, he was going through some challenges, and I was able to help him and support him and give him counsel and guidance. And he was reconciled to his wife, and God totally transformed their lives. And they've had a beautiful relationship ever since then. Well, a few years later, me and my wife got married, and so I started having some questions about marriage and how do you deal with this and how do you deal with that. And Clifton was right there for me, showing me, hey, here's how you love your wife and here's how you lead your wife. So it's a two-way street.
Now, again, I certainly would encourage some people that maybe would like to learn some lessons from you so they don't make the same mistakes. It's always better to learn a lesson vicariously than experientially. You have on the website here, for example, what's happening in Dallas, what's happening in San Antonio. And certainly there would be someone be willing to meet with you or to maybe give you some directions so that if you wanted to develop something like bridge builders in your community, they could be able to contact you, couldn't they?
Absolutely. Bridge Builders is focused here in the work in Dallas, but we are about the work of God all over the world. And so if there's people that want to build a ministry like Bridge Builders in their city and have a heart for the poor or the least, then we are certainly willing to share and open up our doors to showing them, hey, here's how we've done it. here's how God has used our work, and we encourage you and send you out to go do it as well. But absolutely, if anybody wants to be involved in a work like this, we are available to help them in any way that we can.
And again, even internationally, for people listening to this, I mean, your dad went to Romania last week. This time I was in Hungary, and I go to Hungary about every other year. And of course, he went to Brazil. So the kingdom of God is not limited by geographical situations.
No.
Certainly, there are opportunities to build kingdoms anywhere. And certainly, again, if people wanted to contact you, it's hisbridgebuilders.org, but you don't have to remember all that. Just click on the picture there of Michael, and you can find that link. And then, of course, if you click on the book, it is available both as a hardback, and it's fairly inexpensive, or in Kindle. So if you wanted to download it and read it, and I would just encourage you to take the time to find out a little bit more about some of these issues. And I know that you will be blessed. So, Michael, I appreciate you taking the time to visit us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a blast.
We have had Michael Craven on before, and kind of a who's who that have endorsed this book of individuals that have been on this program. Of course, we mentioned Michael Craven, and O.S. Hawkins has been on the program with us, David McKinley, to mention just a few, and all sorts of other people that endorse the book, and I think you're going to find a lot of help. Again, a lot of resources we're making available to you on Point of View today. The first, of course, as I mentioned, was the Pray, Organize, and Vote. If you are looking for more information, and I'll have more to say about that in the second hour, we really want to get you voter guides and encourage you to make sure that not only are you registered to vote, and if you're a listener to Point of View, probably are registered to vote, but to actually use some of the resources. Because if you click on there is a button there, are you registered? And so if you're not sure, or if you have a friend, neighbor, coworker, church member that's not sure they're registered to vote, there are still opportunities for you to register. So you can click on and check that out. There's an online voter registration. And of course, most importantly, we have the iVoter guide there that is just outstanding. We're going to be doing some more interviews on that. So certainly take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. And a couple of weeks ago, of course, we were talking about our trip to both Israel and Greece. And we were able to, of course, make both of those work. But some of you have said, well, the deadline just passed. If you still are interested, there's still time to slip that in, because just the other day we had somebody that was going to go just to Israel, then they decided to go to Israel and Greece. Somebody else decided to go to Greece. So we can probably slip a few more of you in. If you have been thinking about it and wondered if the deadline had come and passed, we still probably could find room for you if you act really quickly. And so we have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. Next hour, we're going to spend some time talking about this New Hampshire primary, about the campaigns, and of course, giving you a chance to make some comments. We ran out of time yesterday, and some of you had some very important things to say about some of the candidates and some of the issues, so we'll give you that opportunity. But let's take a break. If you'd like to find some of the information we're talking about, it's at pointofview.net. We'll take a break and come back with more right after these messages.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy, but by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, love to know who you would support. New Hampshire vote tonight, and that's really kicking off the campaign. Not that the Iowa caucus wasn't important, but these votes are really going to begin to become even more significant, because after all, you had a number of possible delegates up in Iowa, but let's be honest, a grand total of 30 total, but 27 that are actually up for grabs. When you go to New Hampshire, you have another 23, but then they begin to add up very quickly, because 50 in the South Carolina Republican primary, and then a number of others in the South Carolina Democratic primary a little bit later. You have their various caucuses. First, the Nevada Republican caucus of 30, and then, of course, the Nevada Democratic caucus, 43. And then you get to March 1st. And then this changes everything. 12 different primaries, a caucus, as well as one for Democrats that can vote abroad. A few days later, in March 5th, you have Kansas, you have Kentucky's Republican caucus, you have Louisiana, you have Maine's Republican caucus, you have a Nebraska Democratic caucus, and they pick up very quickly. So now those people who are poised to begin to develop momentum and have a ground game are going to be more successful, and some of those that have not been able to pick up delegates or have not been able to raise funds, it is very, very different. So those are some topics I want to address today. Just before I do, and I'll start taking some phone calls if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I do want to pick up something I was going to talk about yesterday. I'm kind of glad I waited a day, and that has to do with one of the ads that appeared in the Super Bowl. The controversy that has come from those who are pro-abortion has been striking. Let me just read from two individuals. Gary Bauer wrote about it on Monday, and he said the radical pro-abortion group NARAL is once again doing its best to prove that the left denies the basic science of biology. And it has to do with this commercial that appeared on the Super Bowl. It was the Doritos commercial. I had a chance to watch it, and actually I think it's been shown before, but nevertheless, you have a husband eating Doritos while the wife is getting ultrasound. Now, she's a little bit frustrated with his inattention, but then when he starts waving the chip around, the baby in utero starts following it, trying to grab for it, and then eventually he puts it in one place and the baby's born. Now, it's kind of a corny commercial, but the point is, Gary Bauer says this was too much for NARAL, which tweeted its condemnation of Doritos for using anti-choice tactic in humanizing fetuses. Oh, my goodness. I can't believe they said that. What exactly does NARAL think a fetus is? Fetus is Latin for bearing young offspring, a young while still in the womb, all of which a human unborn baby. They said NARAL's reaction speaks volumes. The only way it can justify abortion is by first dehumanizing the unborn in the womb. And once it's accomplished, destroying a blob of tissue is much easier. Well, Jim Dennison wrote about this as well. That's why I'm glad I waited. Which he said a Doritos advertisement made the top 5 Super Bowl ads in USA Today's poll, depicts a pregnant mother getting an ultrasound. And again, I talk about some of that. And here, this is where you have NARAL, pro-choice, immediately tweeted their complaint about the ad's anti-choice tactic of humanizing fetuses. Their strategy is logical, Jim Dennison says. When people realize that a fetus is human, they're less likely to support abortion. And so he goes through and talks about some of this as well. and I think illustrates that this has been kind of an interesting reaction. You have to think about it from an abortionist point of view. They don't want people to realize that what's inside the womb is a human being, is a person. So obviously they want to dehumanize it. Okay, we got that. But it seems to me that by putting out a tweet or complaining about it, you just draw more attention to this fact. And of course, it illustrates, as we have pointed out on this program so many times before, why if a woman is coming in for an abortion and they have to And this is, I think, one of those times where American people had a chance to see a child in the ultrasound. Now, it's obviously fictitious with the child moving around more than one would actually move around, but nevertheless, it just once again reminds us that we have a window to the womb, and what's in there is actually a human being, a person deserving of protection. And I think it was striking that NARAL, the pro-choice NARAL, was complaining about that. They would have been better if they just simply had ignored it. They drew more attention to it. And maybe in terms of the pro-life movement, that's a good thing. If you'd like to join our conversation, I'm going to have some things to say about the New Hampshire primary and about the campaign. But if you did not have a chance to join me yesterday, we're going to put you to the front of the line. And one of those individuals is Ann Helen in Georgia on the Good News Network. I think you wanted to join us yesterday, and so you get to be able to go to the front of the line. What would you like to say today? See if we got her there. Do we have her? Are you there? Well, I'll get her in just a minute. We'll see if we can make that work. And while we're doing so, let me just mention again my sympathies to those of you that are in the early primary states. New York Times put it this way: at the final hour of primary season here, amid vicious mailers and ceaseless television ads, there seems no escape from the ugliness. And what you found is they told the story about residents at one place put up little handwritten notes: no solicitation, political or otherwise. Please respect our privacy. We promise not to knock on your door. Because the point they're making is the attention is an essential element of life in this first state to hold a primary. The civic price paid for admission to an election that matters. Hotels fill, businesses boom briefly. Surely the backbench voting states, New Jersey, Nebraska, Indiana, South Dakota, would gladly take on the trouble. This season, though, the psychic toll here was felt heavier than usual. Drifting over the bistros, the school gyms, and veterans halls has been a gloominess coloring the candidates' questions were asked about heroin in the Islamic State, student debt, and global disease. And residents have long been the primary calendar's bulwark of bluntness, following Iowa nice with northeastern candor. Yet the candidates and their deep-pocket allies have ensured a deeper nastiness this cycle, producing and pursuing vitriol as less a secret than a strategy. Here is where Governor Chris Christie talked about tales of Marco Rubio being the boy in the bubble and then bursting it. And here there is Marco Rubio, whose allies treated voters here to a mailer disparaging Jeb Busher with the pre-campaign words of his mother, Barbara Bush: "We've had enough Bushes," and on it goes. But I do always want to apologize to those of you that live in Iowa or in New Hampshire, because the pummeling that takes place with direct mail and television ads seems to be relentless. But a lot of that is now going to culminate in a vote tonight, and we'll spend some time tomorrow talking about it. But let's take a break. When we come back, let's get some of those phone calls. If you've been wanting to express your opinion about a particular candidate. Yesterday, we spent a fair amount of time talking about Donald Trump. Talked a little bit about Marco Rubio. We had some people calling in as well about Ted Cruz. But if those are individuals that you would like to talk about, or if there are some other candidates that deserve some attention, or some issues that simply have not been raised, let's give you a chance in this hour just before the final vote in New Hampshire. Give us a call, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of those calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Joel Rosenberg was on my radio program recently to talk about his new novel, The First Hostage. We didn't spend too much time talking about his book, but instead focused on the phenomenon of apocalyptic Islam. Let me explain what that is. There is both radical Islam as well as apocalyptic Islam. The vast majority of Muslims do not fit into either category. According to some reliable polls, only about 10% of the 1.6 billion Muslims subscribe to the concept of violent jihad. Millions and millions of Muslims may believe in Islamic eschatology and even believe that we're entering into the end time, but that doesn't mean that they believe in violence as a way to achieve it. Radical Muslim groups like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, the Taliban, and the Muslim Brotherhood may use violence against Jews and Christians. They want to push them off of Muslim lands. But they differ from apocalyptic Islam. Joel Rosenberg puts it this way: radical Islam seeks to attack us. Apocalyptic Islam seeks to annihilate us. Apocalyptic Muslim groups would include the leaders of ISIS, now called the Islamic State, and the top leaders in Iran. They're driven by Muslim prophecies that you can find in the Quran and the Hadith. They believe that the end of days is at hand, and they believe that their Islamic Messiah will come to establish an Islamic kingdom known as a caliphate. And they also believe that the Messiah will implement Sharia law throughout the globe and force everyone to submit to this caliphate. Now, Joel Rosenberg has found that few world leaders understand these issues. Sadly, the current president and many of the current candidates for president do not understand the danger of apocalyptic genocidal Islam. We should pray that they understand, because our future depends on it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's look first at the Democratic primary tonight in New Hampshire. Then we'll look at the Republican primary. And if you'd like to join us or express your opinion about a particular candidate, an issue, a topic, or many of the debates that we have been subjected to, 1-800-351-1212. The only real question in the Democratic primary is how much does Bernie Sanders win by? Because almost all of the polls all agree that he will win by a little or a lot. Now, this is kind of intriguing. The variation is striking. Let's take the one that was actually taken today, the ARG poll, and that has Bernie Sanders winning by 9 points, 53 Sanders, 44 Clinton. Again, you will notice as we go through this that none of these add up to 100% because they're still undecided. Then you look at the Emerson poll. You might say, why are we using the Emerson poll? Well, it turns out that this one, even though it's a student poll, was one of the more accurate ones in Iowa. And in this case, they have Bernie Sanders winning by 12 points, 54 to 42. Then if you go to the UMass Lowell one, it's even more extreme. You have Bernie Sanders winning by 16, Bernie Sanders 56, Clinton 40. And if that's not enough for you, there is one which is a CNN WMUR poll, which has Bernie Sanders winning by 26. Bernie Sanders 61, Clinton 35. Now, you have got to believe that if those last couple of polls are even close, then all the rumors about Hillary Clinton shaking up her campaign staff have got to be true and will actually pull out. And it's interesting that the Wall Street Journal the other day said taking Sanders seriously, and that is it's fashionable to describe Mr. Sanders as the progressive version of Donald Trump. but that is only true in that they both tap into public disaffection with the status quo. Mr. Trump has a populist instinct but few fixed ideological principles, whereas Bernie Sanders is a true blue man of the left. He would be the most left-wing Democratic nominee since George McGovern in 1972, but his economic agenda is more radical and hasn't been seen in the United States since the 1930s. The reason for that is very interesting. The estimates are that if you count up the various tax hikes that Bernie Sanders is calling for, it could indeed cost about $10 trillion, $9.8 trillion, but we'll just round it up to that. And assuming, on the other hand, that the Sanders changes have no economic impact, the plan would collect a whopping $13 trillion in additional tax revenue. But, of course, that's based upon the assumption that people don't make decisions about their economic circumstances. As we've talked on this program before, it's not a static model. You raise taxes. People don't just sit there and pay the taxes. Sometimes people just stop working, or they take their business somewhere else, or they invest in the stock market and close down the business. So there are indeed some very significant factors in that, but the bottom line is that here is a man who has been willing to call himself a socialist and on the same time is going to beat Hillary Clinton by as little as 9 points and by as many as 26 points, which I think most people would call a drubbing. And so certainly that is one issue. Now, let me come back to the Republican side in just a minute, but let's take a phone call along the way so that I can give some of you a chance to join the conversation. So let's head out first to Ohio. And Kelly, I think you want to talk about Donald Trump. He's going to be who I'll be talking about in just a minute, but what are your comments?
Well, my comments are, I don't think that Donald Trump favors people in general. I think I think he has a lot of money to throw around, and I think that he's just campaigning to put on a show. I don't think he is really trying to become the president of the United States, because someone that would try to become the president of the United States would get people to favor them and do more things for people, like health care, like Hillary Clinton.
So just the fact that he's not giving specificity or specifics, is that kind of your concern, or are you talking about his character? What are we talking about exactly?
Well, I think Hillary Clinton has a great reputation for helping our country and also the people in it. And she favors, like, she started a health clinic for women and children, I believe. She's done that. She has the support of her husband, which was an ex-president of the United States, Bill Clinton. And I think that they have Christian values. I'm a Christian, and I really want someone that favors people. That's what I'm saying. And weren't you talking about sticky notes?
Yeah, about which?
The sticky notes that people were putting out.
Oh, just the notes, yeah. And again, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no solicitation. Everybody's kind of tired of all the various flyers showing up on their doorstep and the doorbells being rung. And, of course, just a constant pummeling from these different television ads.
Okay. Well, I think that it would be really good for Hillary if you guys could just put a good word out there for her that, you know, she's doing a really good job despite the fact that people are worried about her emails and all that. I mean, her trying to contact her daughter is no big deal. I mean, if it has something to do with, you know, our country and us being at harm, I think that.
Okay, I think we lost you there. I didn't hang up. I think you just lost your cell phone coverage. Let me just mention, people wanting to know about the email, I did a commentary just recently on that, and I was learning some very important lessons that I did not know before, and that is, it so happens that when you look at some of these actual emails, they are at the highest level of classification, and so technically the inspector general was not allowed to look at them because they're at that level of classification. So we are talking about real possibility. Before this, you had to kind of wonder, but I think we are talking about now a real possibility that Hillary Clinton will be indicted. And if indeed that is the case, we'll have to see how that affects Americans as well. But let's take another phone call because we were talking about Bernie Sanders, and I think Vinny in New Hampshire wants to talk about Bernie. So you've got the floor. What would you like to add?
Yeah, Kerby, I was wondering what you thought. I was wondering if the Democratic Party allowed Bernie Sanders to run as a Democrat in this primary to make Hillary Clinton look less extremely liberal relative to Bernie Sanders. And if maybe that was going to backfire on them today when she winds up with egg on her face after Bernie beats her by 10 or 15 or 20 percentage points.
Yes, and I don't think they let him. I mean, they couldn't keep him from it, but I think there was a kind of a complacency that said, look, this is a coronation. But it wouldn't hurt for Hillary Clinton to have somebody to challenge her. And then on many issues, she can look a little bit more like the common sense candidate and not look quite as radical. But sometimes the problem with that is, and it has been a truism of American politics for decades, even Richard Nixon used to say, you know, the Republicans would run to the right and then race to the middle, and the Democrats would run to the left and then race to the middle. When you're trying to win over your Democratic constituency, the people most likely to show up tonight in New Hampshire, last week in Iowa, and in the future in Nevada and South Carolina and Alabama and Texas and Colorado and all the places where this is going to be taking place, Georgia, are individuals that probably are a little bit more motivated. And so they're going to be perhaps a little more liberal, a little more progressive, whatever phrase you want to use, than the typical Democratic voter. Well, Bernie takes that whole section away from her. And so as a result, sometimes that's a difficulty. So whether it was intended or not, I don't think they could really prevent him from running against her. But at the same time, it has gone in a way that very few would have predicted. If I had told you this time last year, as we were just beginning to think about the election, that Bernie Sanders would be beating Hillary Clinton, and not just a little bit, but by a lot in New Hampshire, you might say, well, maybe, just because he's from Vermont. But if I told you that they were basically neck and neck in all sorts of other places around the country, you would certainly be convinced that I had lost my mind. Of course, if a year ago I told you that Donald Trump was going to be the person that wins New Hampshire and could be the odds-on favorite to be the Republican nominee, you really would be convinced that I lost my mind, and yet that's exactly the reality that we're facing. So let's take a break. When we come back, do want to spend a little bit of time looking at how much Donald Trump might win by tonight, and that is, again, striking. These polls could be way off, and oftentimes they are, so we don't talk a lot about the polls for that reason. But as close as we are now, let's see if we can learn some lessons. So visit the website. We have our Pray, Organize, and Vote. And as I mentioned in the first hour, we also still would love to see one or two of you. If you'd like to join with us in our trip to Israel and Greece, we certainly were able to meet our needs to have the trip take place, but we might be able to slip in a few more of you if you're interested. So visit the website pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Already talked to Vinny from New Hampshire. I see another one from New Hampshire. We'll always put our callers from New Hampshire first because they are where a lot of the attention of the nation is right now. Just before I take some more of those phone calls, let me just finish my point. And that is, if you look at many of these polls, and again, take all these polls with a grain of salt, might be an salt block of salt, but nevertheless, if you look at the ARG poll, they have Donald Trump winning by 16 points. Trump 33, Rubio 14, Kasich 17, Cruz 10. They're all pretty much Trump, Rubio, Kasich, Cruz, and Bush and Christie and Friarina, Carson further back. If you look at the Emerson poll, which I mentioned just a minute ago for the Republicans, again, they have Donald Trump winning by 15. Again, Trump 31, Rubio 12, and all the way down. You look at the UMass Lowell News poll, they have him winning by 21. 34 to 13, and so that's pretty striking. The others are at least in the same area. Trump winning by 14, both in the CNN poll and the ARG tracking poll. So it is quite possible that he will have a significant lead, and he will carry that throughout the night. And so there's really no real surprise in either of these in terms of who's number one. The real question is who's number two, and most of these polls have Marco Rubio number two. And what happened to Ted Cruz? Well, in almost all these polls, they have him as number four. You might remember that in one of the debates, they brought up the question about the fact that Senator Ted Cruz referred to Donald Trump embodies New York values. And, of course, the argument is that, well, that are those people that are kind of New Yorkers. Well, that might have helped in Iowa, but that will kill you in a place like New Hampshire. Okay, New Hampshire's not quite New York, but it's close enough. And there were a lot of people that said, if that's what you think of us, that's what we think of you. So you have the circumstance in which Ted Cruz wins in Iowa, probably, or we'll see how this plays out tonight, comes in fourth. Marco Rubio comes in third in Iowa, maybe comes in second in New Hampshire. Now, that's exactly according to their playbook. They were saying Marco Rubio, third in Iowa, second in New Hampshire, then hopefully first in South Carolina. That was kind of their plan. I don't know if it's going to play out, but nevertheless, that is the case. And I think it just illustrates how these various primaries are very significant. And so let's first of all take a call from New Hampshire, since we were talking about Bernie Sanders and Republicans. Always love to hear from our New Hampshire listeners. Our eyes are focused on your state. And so, Jackie, in New Hampshire, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Yes, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, first I'll just comment on New Hampshire values, what you just said about the New York values. And I can say that what I experience in New Hampshire is that a lot of us really take our time to investigate each candidate, and that they say you can't buy New Hampshire votes and things like that. So
very true. Yeah, and you really expect to even meet some of those candidates face to face. I mean, some of these other primaries, they'll see them on TV, but I get to go to Vermont, New Hampshire, upstate New York almost every year, so I have a real sense of. If you bring all those individuals into that state, you have a chance to actually sit across the table and meet some of these individuals.
I mean, Bernie Sanders was just a mile down the road a couple weeks ago, and Chris Christie was here for the parade. I got a picture with him. So they do make a lot of effort here, and Hillary Clinton, of course, so that's a really great part of being in New Hampshire for this. And I guess my comment was that it seems to me that a lot of us will, can make decisions for these candidates based on our emotional, attachment. And I feel like Bernie Sanders and Trump, they really speak to the frustration that a lot of the citizens of America are feeling right now with our government. And that I just urge people to to take time to really look at the track record of the candidates and put less weight on, I guess, the rhetoric and what they say, what we're experiencing as a country and why it needs to be fixed and all that. And that's great. But if you do a little bit of research, you can look at the track record of the candidates and really see if are they going to be able to do anything once they get into government. So I think it's a good thing to balance that out and, remember how the Bible tells us to be careful about making too many decisions based on, just what's pulling at our heartstrings.
Sure.
And
Track
to be,
record, really important.
Logical about it. Yeah.
The other question I've got to ask you, I meant to ask this of Vinny, are you just feeling like you've been pummeled by all of these television commercials and all the flyers and things like that?
Absolutely. It is incredibly nonstop. And, just today I got home and on my gate was hung a Hillary, it's huge actually, a little poster board or something that someone hangs. So they're out in full force on our networks and it's fine except for the bashing and the negative, that it's very negative and I don't hear a lot of solutions. Really good key issue, promotion of what they'll do for key issues and things like that. So, but yes, you're right. We are pummeled.
Like I said, I just advanced publicity and especially apology and condolences and all of the words I can possibly use for those of you that live in Iowa and New Hampshire. And for those of you that are in Georgia or Minnesota or Massachusetts or Texas, yours is coming real quick and you will understand what these poor people have been subjected to. But let's take a few more phone calls. We'll go from New Hampshire to one side of the country to California on the other side of the country, and that is KYCC. Casey, thank you for joining us today. I think you had a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a little confused, and I forgive my ignorance, but I always thought that the Iowa caucuses was going to decide who the Republican and who the Democratic frontrunner would be, and then that would be the two presidential candidates. And so now we're at New Hampshire. And so I'm a little confused as how all this works. And if you don't mind, I'll just hang up and listen to your response.
Sure. And again, you're asking a question. I'm sure a lot of other people are saying, okay, I sort of understand this, but I don't exactly. Let's go back to Iowa, and that is what is called a caucus. And we will have a few more of those. This is a very unusual set, but ultimately, let's use the Republicans just to make it simpler, and that is you had 30 delegates at stake in Iowa, but only 27 that were determined by the vote. And you need over 2,000, well, actually there's more than 2,000 delegates. You need over 1,200 in round numbers. I won't give you all the numbers in order for you to be the nominee. So after Iowa, Ted Cruz has 8, but that's a lot smaller than 1,200. Rubio and Trump have 7, but again, that's not going to get them anywhere close to the 1,200 that they would need. Carson has 3, Bush, Fiorina, Kasich, Paul have 1. So they have delegates that will go to the Republican convention, but they need a whole lot more. So in New Hampshire, you have another 23 that are up for grabs, and assuming that Donald Trump gets the kind of turnout people are assuming, most of them are assuming that he will get 34% of the vote. So that means he's probably going to get probably a third of those or so. So he may get 8 or 9, depending on how high that is. Then Marco Rubio might get, maybe 6. But you can kind of do the math real quickly. So Marco Rubio now has 15, and Donald Trump has about 15. Ted Cruz might have 10. But they're still a long way away from those 1,200 delegates that they need in order to actually be able to get the nomination at the Republican convention. So they move on from New Hampshire to Nevada to South Carolina. And then, of course, then you run into what I call Super Tuesday, and that's March 1st, where you have 12 different primaries all happening on the same day and a caucus for our listeners up there in Alaska, and then one for the Democrats, which we are, since we're just using Republicans, won't count. Then you have some on March 5th and the rest. So the bottom line is that oftentimes what you have are individuals that win a few here and there, but they don't collect enough of the delegates to actually be the nominee. And Iowa is a good example because in 2008, the person that won the actual Iowa caucus was Mike Huckabee, but it was John McCain who actually became the nominee. Then in 2012, Rick Santorum won the Iowa caucus, but it was Mitt Romney who won the campaign. So if that gives you a little bit of an idea, there is still a long, long way to go. And since you live in California, let me mention that there will be a time when you get to vote, and that's all the way to June 7th. And if they keep splitting these votes like this, that means that it's possible that in California, on June 7th, you might be the one that determines who the nominee is. Let's take a break, though. We'll take some more phone calls, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to North Carolina. They'll actually be voting on March 15th. But, Rhonda, I think you'd like to add some things to the conversation, so you have the floor.
Yes, I may not resonate the same opinion as the other callers, but I did want to say I'm a Democrat.
Uh-huh.
However, I'm not sure I'll vote Democrat this year. I don't trust Hillary Clinton. There's too many questions behind some of her actions as Secretary of State, and I think our country needs fresh, new eyes. A lot of the voters now are looking for a better economy. It's interesting, the price of gas now, since we don't have anyone associated with oil in the White House. And there's just too many positions bought by the wealthier class. And the middle class is declining.
Yes. Well, you've done a good job of putting the list together. I mean, this is all the reason why I think a lot of people want to say, after 7 years of Barack Obama, is this working? I mean, I think we have some policies that need to be changed, and yet they're not going to be changed if Hillary Clinton comes in and just becomes a third term of Barack Obama, which is pretty much what she's planning, saying that. Go ahead. Yes.
Exactly, and I don't think she'll be profound and stand up when other countries are a threat to us. And Obama, I'm totally disappointed with him.
Are you looking at any Republican? Now, of course, you can still, of course, since you're a registered Democrat, actually vote in the Democratic primary. You could vote for Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton. Or are you thinking of actually trying to vote in the Republican primary? And if so, who you might think about?
I will vote Republican, and if Donald Trump is the nominee, wonderful.
You know, they're saying about 20% of Democrats right now said that they would vote for Donald Trump. So you're one of that 20%, I guess.
The only thing I have to say about Trump is he needs to learn to be more diplomatic with his personality.
Yeah.
However, we need a strong, profound person in office that's willing and ready to make a change to this country. We're in such trouble. We need our borders closed. I think we have sleeper cells in this country, and they're just lying in wait to cause a catastrophe in our country.
Rhonda, you sound like a Republican. Even if you're registered as a Democrat, you do sound like a Republican. I've heard you list a whole lot of things that seem to fit a lot better with the platform of the Republican Party, and especially some of the things Donald Trump's been talking about. Go ahead.
Well, you sit back and you see all these things happening that are not good for our country. I mean, I'm totally ready to register as a Republican.
Well, I appreciate you call. And, you know, it's interesting because Rhonda lives in North Carolina, and they vote March 15th. And by this time 4 years ago and this time 8 years ago on the Republican side, it was already a done deal. I mean, everybody primarily from about March on were voting for Mitt Romney because he was the presumptive nominee. And even 8 years before that, you had almost everybody voting for John McCain because he was pretty much the presumptive nominee at that point. Barack Obama, of course, won North Carolina, but it wasn't as big a deal because there were still some possibilities that Hillary might be able to beat him. But what we're seeing is they keep splitting these votes up, then it's going to mean those of us in the past that voted in later primaries, we might actually be able to vote. And just a minute ago, of course, I was talking with Casey. You know, I grew up in California, as I've said before, and oftentimes when you would vote in June, the election was way over. But the reality is, even now that I've lived in Texas, most of the time when you get to March, it's over. It's not the case because the assumption is that Donald Trump will get, maybe 31%, maybe 34% of the vote. But remember what I just told you. Getting a third of the vote doesn't mean a whole lot because there's only 23 delegates at stake at the moment. And so it really takes you to at least March 1st, that Super Tuesday, before you could begin to pile up enough delegates that it begins to be a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump's going to be the nominee, Marco Rubio is going to be the nominee, Ted Cruz is going to be the nominee, whatever it might be. And so this means in March 15th, when you get to North Carolina, you get to Missouri, you get to Illinois, you get to Florida, you get to Ohio, those votes are going to mean something. And I have a lot of listeners in those states, whereas before said, well, it's not really fair that people in Iowa and New Hampshire determine who our nominee is. We should have an opportunity to determine that. It's quite likely that those of you in those states in March 15th, or again, states on March 1st, like Alabama and Alaska and Arkansas, Colorado, Georgia, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, Virginia, will have a much greater say. And that seems to me to be very fair. Let's take one last phone call. And again, we'll always take more tomorrow, but let's end with this one in Michigan. Clinton, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
What would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, I'm a Democrat, and I actually am going to be voting for Bernie Sanders. I feel like he's actually closer to the Christian viewpoint than any of the other candidates, except for, or that are on the Democratic side anyway. I mean, obviously the Republican ones talk about their Christian beliefs a lot, whereas Bernie Sanders hasn't really, he's not as religious at all, or religious at all really, but he's kind of expressed more of the golden rule and the idea of taking care of your fellow man, which seems to be more in line with the Christian viewpoints than, in fact, the Pope, for instance, could agree with just about everything he said except for the abortion and gay marriage, of course.
First of all, I wish you'd called earlier, because I'm sure we'd have quite a discussion, but I'm up against the end of the program. But let me just say that the biggest problem with Bernie Sanders is he wants to do it with basically a gun in his hand. In other words, you are compelled to do these kinds of things. I have no problem if somebody wants to, as we talked about even in the first hour here, give generously to help the poor and to pour their time and energy into that. But when they say, we're going to tax you, and if you don't pay this rate of taxation, you will be put into jail. There will be compulsion in that. And of course, again, you have to define Christian in a really broad sense when you are talking about an individual who, for example, is completely pro-abortion, 100%. He gets 100% rating with the ACLU. So on all the religious liberty issues that we talk about here on Friday, he's completely on the other side. On terms of everything from same-sex marriage to additional rights for homosexuals, he fits there. But nevertheless, we're out of time, and always give you a chance to express your opinion, because the program is called Point of View. Well, tonight, the New Hampshire primary. We've had a caucus, now we'll have a primary, and pretty soon we're going to be way into the election season, so we'll do our best to try to provide you with some coverage. So again, visit the website if you'd like to know a little bit more about our interview in the first hour with Michael Fechner. That is still available. If you'd like to get some information, pray, organize, and vote, you are welcome to do so. And like I said, if any of you would like to still join us on our trip to Israel and Greece, I think we could probably still fit you in. And then, of course, we're going to move on to some other topics. So all of it available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow after the New Hampshire primary.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day.